Okay, so I wanted to touch on my views on Halloween. There's a lot going on. It's November 1st. There's been a lot of discussion amongst Christendom across the internet about whether or not we should be celebrating Halloween. I wanted to give you some of my thoughts. Some of you have already had my thoughts and had a good conversation with me on Facebook. Thank you so much for having a peaceful and relaxed conversation about it. Even if you come out feeling differently than I've come out to understand. So I kind of wanted to touch on that and try to get in touch with this idea here. Is for me, and my reply was here, but for me, the core of what we're doing here in Western society is very different than its origins. And so I wanted to start out with a few original things so that people who, but depending on where you land, I want to start off understanding and admitting that there are actual, true, evil roots to Halloween. And if you don't understand that, you need to do some research. There's absolutely a position where you can rationally say, because of its roots, because of what it originally was intended to mean, that number one, I don't want to participate. Number two, that there are actually people who do, on Halloween, actively participate in evil acts on the specific day. Obviously, plenty of occultists do truly use this as their Christmas, right? And they do practice occultic things on the day of Halloween. It's also rational for one to recognize that in the sense of trying to figure out where you land spiritually, if you are sensitive to these things, like in the way Paul describes in the New Testament, that when you have meat that was basically slain and then offered to an idol, and if you will, to a demon, and then they sell that in the marketplace, and a Christian buys that and starts to serve that for food, it is rational for you to, if you have a conscience about that, to say, I won't partake and I really don't want to be around it. And those are all healthy, proper things, because one's conscience is what is of utmost importance to maintain. One's conscience and really one's ability to rationalize and understand where your heart is in relation to your Creator. Just like Paul, however, describes that there are times to recognize that the meat itself is just meat. It wasn't intended to, it wasn't created by demons. It was created by God, and therefore it has the attributes of God's design and can be freely partaken in. However, there is a caveat that Paul discusses in 1 Corinthians about that concept. And for that understanding, one has to apply both the principial understanding of the exegetical understanding of what Paul was talking about in that time period, and understand the modern constraints that change the way we apply the principle in comparison to what it was done originally. So if you first just take the idea that Paul is describing, we do not want to eat meat offered to idols in the presence of what he calls the weaker brother. And that is a brother who would feel that it is compromising of them to partake in that meal. So if you have your brother in your room, or you are planning on doing things together, or you are in close proximity to one another, it is wise for you to think of others so that you don't, number one, trigger someone else's conscience that would be too problematic. But at the same time, Paul also says that it is appropriate to eat meat. And so depending on how your initial context to the individuals who are the weaker brother, the people who feel in their conscience that they should not partake in things that were intended to be offered to idols, to demons, if you will, then therefore one should be sensitive to that and give deference to the weaker brother. Now, what do we do with this in the modern age? Because what can easily balloon out is the consequence that every single Christian on the face of the planet Now, because of the internet and because of modern life with the ability to move about quickly, whether it's through whatever form of transport, now becomes a relevant check upon your life when it comes to what you ought and ought not to do. In other words, I have to take a survey of all my brothers and see where they are, who know me, and if most of them have a problem, I shouldn't do it, even though they're hundreds of miles away, even though I'm connected only through the internet with these people, right? No. There is rationality to understand how to apply that principle to what we're talking about today. Proximity is the principle to recognize when applying 1 Corinthians about eating meat to people in your proximity. And so, for instance, if my wife had a problem with me celebrating Halloween because of her convictions, then I would honor my wife and not do so. If let's say I had children and one of my children had a problem with us celebrating Halloween in their conscience, then I would also do so for the sake of preserving their conscience and actually lifting up the weaker brother. That is what Paul is describing. Paul is not, and perhaps my church. If there are a lot of members who have come out of the occult in my church, and in my context to them, not everybody in the church, but in my relationship to them, I know that if we're going to do an activity together with my friend, I'm not going to do that activity in a way that would violate their conscience, right? But again, it is not running one's life by the dictates of everyone else's conscience except your own. It's recognizing that when you are in proximity to someone who has a weaker conscience, a conscience that is recognizing that, well, okay, this thing isn't inherently bad because God made it and it's healthy and there are healthy ways of doing this, but because of the context to it and my conscience to it, whether you've come out of a sin in relationship or whatever, I don't want to partake, that I don't want that my brother to be in sin over that issue. It's similar with alcohol. If, let's say, someone was in your group, was intending on doing things that were in a pub, but you had a person in the group that was going to be, who had come out of alcoholism and is continuing to either struggle with being sober or has had a lot of victory, but they don't want to trip up themselves into sin once again. That would be healthy for the body of that group. Since that person is invited, the proximity to that person now, we defer to the weaker brother. Or we also give the weaker brother an option. Right? It's not a problem if the weaker brother chooses on their own behalf to exit the group and go ahead, guys. You can do it. That's not a problem either. But it's most important that the Christian brothers, when someone's conscience is triggered in a healthy way, that we defer to each other when that is necessary. But proximity is an important component to a wise application in that way. No human being can run their life by the dictates of everybody on social media who might be triggered by anything you might do. That's not a healthy way to live. It's not a practical way to live. So proximity is an important thing. Now you can determine just how far that perimeter extends. And that's, again, between you and your conscience and the Lord on honoring the principle of the weaker brother and of eating meat. This is applying the same thing to Halloween. Halloween, in and of itself, in the way we practice it in the West, is not actually what its originally roots intended. And the first way to think about this is thinking about it in the context of what all the holidays are celebrated as. Can someone celebrate Christmas without being a Christian? Absolutely. Can someone celebrate Easter without being recognizing Christ's death and resurrection? Unfortunately, absolutely. Sadly, those are true. But the reason for that is because our culture has created a new and, if you will, emergent entity. It's different than what the original intent of these holidays were aiming toward. And so because they created something that is distinct, starkly distinct from what the original intent of the holidays were, we've created Santa Claus, we've created, elves and all these other things that is not inherently a product of the intended holiday of Christmas, Christ Mass, or Easter, the Easter Bunny. Those do, in fact, have origins from, if you will, pagan derivatives. Now, someone can make the argument for Kris Kringle. Let's not go into that right now. But the idea is our culture has set up a way to celebrate these holidays without engaging in the spiritual side of the holiday. That is the same thing, so that an atheist can participate in Christmas without having, intended on in worshiping Christ, sadly. A Christian, happily, can participate in Halloween without having worshipped Satan. Because we have extracted the original intent from its roots, and we have created it in a very different light. And I'd like to submit to you that the way in which we actually practice Halloween in the West, in the modern West, is what we actually do no different than what we do when we put on a stage play performance. If you have no problem with a stage play performance of the Chronicles of Narnia or the Wizard of Oz, then that also should apply in principle to how you think about the day of Halloween. And again, not its origins, how we actually practice it in modern Western society. So think about it this way. When you are performing a dramatic performance of, let's say, the Wizard of Oz, there's Dorothy, there's the Tin Man, there's the Scarecrow, and then there's the Wicked Witch of the West. Someone has to play the Wicked Witch of the West. Now, you could come up with some creative way of someone just playing the voice and it's just like a light or something like that. One could do some form of creation if you really didn't want to play the Wicked Witch of the West. But most people wouldn't have a problem with someone dressing up as the Wicked Witch of the West and I'll get you, my pretty, and then the whole story continuing, right? Most people wouldn't have a problem with someone dramatizing the Chronicles of Narnia, where you are playing, someone has to play the White Witch. So this understanding is that it is appropriate, when in a theatrical narrative sense, to costume and act as even bad guys. One wouldn't think that it would be inherently sinful whatsoever to play Darth Vader if you were to do a fun skit where it was the dark side versus the light side versus Obi-Wan Kenobi. That is really what we do as a culture with Halloween. Halloween is simply a dramatized stage play that instead of a small portion of the community plays and everyone watches, it's all of the community or most of the community dressing up as a character and playing out the character, right? Now, it doesn't exactly hit in an exact way where there's not a direct story, but it is still an embodied narrative that you are embodying, and people play. It's a way to play together. Kids play all the time on the streets. You see people dressed up as Star Wars characters, and they're going to battle it out with some fun lightsaber battles, right? There's all sorts of fun ways that you can narratively embody the character that you are playing on Halloween. And then the other additions, just like other holidays, there are very hollow leftovers, shells of what they formerly were, that certainly have spiritual roots, but that do not actually carry with it the inherent reasoning of spiritual worship when participating in them. So, giving gifts, for instance, or many other holiday things that you could rationalize as a biblical concept, does not inherently translate to someone worshiping were they actually to carry out that. because it's a matter of the heart, number one. Number two, it's not actually a practice of a religion. It's a cultural thing. The same goes for trick-or-treating or, let's say, bobbing for apples. Trick-or-treating, bobbing for apples, things like that, they are inherently cultural constructs in the way they are today, but their original intent absolutely had a spiritual reason. They had a dark spiritual origin. And in that way, if your conscience is triggered by its original intent for the day, similar to the meat, you ought not to participate. And no one should force you or encourage you or say that you should. And that's an important thing that I'm hoping that I'm getting across here. That no one should ever push someone or guilt someone or persuade someone to push past their conscience. It's important to listen to what the Spirit is telling you and what your conscience is telling you. And through that, you are to obey that. And so if someone is bothered by, since these origins of Halloween certainly do have dark pasts, then don't participate. And those who don't mind it, don't force or encourage other people to do that if their conscience says otherwise. That said, when the people who have the conscience, this is similar to what the argument Paul actually makes, when the people who have the conscience say, you shouldn't participate because it has origins, it's meat offered to idols, Paul corrects that. That's actually what Paul was writing to do, was correct those who say you cannot eat meat offered to idols fundamentally or you're in sin. Paul corrects that and says, no, those brothers who are the stronger brothers can participate. But Paul, as an exemplar of how he carried it out, said just for him as a leader, he's going to just make doubly sure that he's not going to cause any unnecessary stumbling by anyone. So he's just not going to partake at all. That was his choice, reasoned choice, based on the principles, based on the truth that he was advocating for leaders to follow. But not everyone is, number one, a leader. But number two, not everyone has to make the same choice that Paul made to not partake whatsoever in those things that may potentially cause someone to stumble. He chose to do that because he was representing a large group of disciples that he had been discipling, and he didn't want anyone looking up and just looking at Paul and doing that. Now, one could obviously make any form of argumentation that anyone who has influence should therefore not participate in Halloween. And that's a rational argument to make that I would never say can't be made from the text or can't be honored by the text. If you believe that, that is a healthy argument, and I see where you're coming from. I also see, based on what is being explained and based on how we understand what Halloween actually is in the world today, not the way it's been, and what Halloween actually functionally happens on Halloween, which is it is a dramatized displaying of cultural narratives that we use to reflect on how to face death. And we can do it with whimsy, and we can do it with valor. And that's the point of the day. The point of the day is to narratively reflect together as a community on how we face death and how death can come about by some form of antagonist. And as a community, dramatize that concept and discuss that. And it is an opportunity, actually, to discuss this. This is why there's great opportunities when you're watching films that take place during, like the horror films that take place, obviously, around the time of Halloween, to discuss what do you do with bad actors. It is a dramatized concept that we are doing as a culture in society to play out these roles. And it is not intended to elevate the evil. It's not intended to say that the evil is good. It's not intended whatsoever to do that. Now, there people who do that, yes, and we ought to make sure that we are not doing that ourselves. But just like I said, just like is being explained, that isn't how our society sees it. We don't practice it that way. There are people who do. And for those people who have come out of that lifestyle, as there's been a person who commented on this thread who said that they had come out of this lifestyle of true demonic possession. I'd love to talk to this person, but I can't confirm or deny exactly what happened. And obviously, were they to have been embodied by a demonic spirit, they would have not have been regenerate beforehand. And so that's fundamental. Satan can try to screw with you, but he can't possess you because your soul is bought with Christ. And so there is no way that can happen without being unregenerate. But hopefully this individual truly has repented and trusted in Christ and now is sealed by the power of the Spirit. And for themselves, they said after coming out of this life, this of recent, they want nothing to do with Halloween. In fact, it terrifies them to think about seeing these images and such. Very important that you listen to that conscience and understanding your background. Same with rock music. Many people make the same argument with rock music. See, I was in part of rock music and it was all about the drugs and sex and rock and roll and even sometimes demon worship. Well, does that inherently mean that all people, when they're participating in enjoying rock music, are doing that? No. It's no different than anybody who would write a book about such things. Is it participating in evil to read, let's say, Mein Kampf? No, of course not. You have to read to understand, but carefully and very, very self-aware that you are, if you do it too much, you could be attracted to the dark side. And this is where it's important to frequency is another area of wisdom to bring to bear on this issue. Are we constantly holding Halloweens? No. Would it be problematic if we just dressed up a lot? No, not at all. I mean, that's what Comic-Cons are. So it's not problematic to do that. But when it comes to like the idea of Halloween, are we having Halloweens all the time? Well, no. So it's once a year, right? And it's really only for the 24-hour period. Even though they try in the stores to get us thinking about it earlier, it's really only happens for 24 hours. So this is an important realization that frequency determines also how much you should be involved. Halloween is a very short amount of time, and regardless if there are other people who do beyond this, the goal of what we should be doing as Christians is number one, being in the world. In the world, let me repeat that, but not of the world. Some see this as being of the world. No. If you were of the world, and in particular, let's say of its origins, you would be starting to practice actual witchcraft, number one. Number two, you would be seeing this as an opportunity to explore, if you were of the world, just other people's faiths. It's fine. That's different too. We are narratively participating in the sense that we are playing a role as no different than a story that you are playing on a stage. It is a costumed character. And part of that is to reflect on how our proper relationship to these creatures are, to these things are. And if you find that troubling, if you find that problematic in your spirit, you ought not to participate. But those who don't can freely participate. And once again, it's proximity. If someone in your family, core family, has a problem, or if you are a leader and you wanted to practice this and you are the leader of a church and your church would find it problematic. And again, it matters about proximity. Okay? Are the people that you're paying attention to going to have a problem with this? Okay? You would have to add some wisdom in there to pray about it. Ask yourself if this is a wise thing. Do you need to apply the weaker brother principle in this situation, even though you are as a leader? It is possible that the Lord may want you to do that, and your conscience may want you to do that. Very important. So this is what I think it's really important to discuss these things to recognize that these things actually were true, that the religious roots to all holidays were intended to practice the religion. We don't do that now in the modern age, though there are some who do, very, very small percentages of people, even on the Christian side, unfortunately, who actually practice the event of the holiday as what it was intended to be. And therefore, we have created a cultural construct which one can participate without participating in the spiritual evil, or whatever spiritual side of it is. Spiritual evil for Halloween, spiritual righteousness for any of these other holidays. And so because of that, it is if you will, a secularization of the day. And the question is now, how do we participate where we are bringing our own ethic? There's no such thing as neutral public square. So we have to bring our own ethic to the table. And I would assert that the ethic that Christians ought to be bringing to the table is to discuss the role that one has in confronting death in a humorous way as well as a heroic way, and the modes that go there, and in also examining the shadow of one's life in the process of thinking through this. In what ways am I playing Darth Vader? In what ways might I be playing any of these other characters? What pathway might I go? It's important to talk about the shadow side of you, the part of you that, if left unchecked by the Spirit and by the brethren helping you, compass you, could become more of the dark side. These are the conversations we should be having as Christians, and also bringing great gospel opportunities to talk about where is evil coming from in the world? Why does this exist? What do we do about the problem of evil? And the problem of good? How do we know it is good? And having conversations in the process of this cultural staging of this story that we're all playing together, to have these conversations. But always remembering that those who have a conscionable issue with this, that they've experienced something that they can't participate in, or out of a healthy fear for not wanting to get anywhere close to it. It's totally fine to stay very, very far away so you're not at all, if you feel like you might be tempted. But there are things within our culture in the process of operating in the world in which we can participate without becoming of the world. And if you feel that your conscience says, I can't actually, for myself, or let's say for my kids, reasonably participate in this and then stand before my Lord, then don't do it. But those who don't, those who, you should always examine yourself, because there might be something that maybe you haven't thought through. Study the scriptures, study the culture, study its origins, make sure you know your history. Don't deny the history, because people do deny, it was never an evil. Yes, it was. There's so many evidences that the original intent for Halloween is absolutely intended for evil, and then the original intent and then that some people still practice it as its original origins intended. So don't blow past that. But the reality is, remember to check yourself about how we actually do it here and what your intentions are and how you can understandably participate and where that line is for you, and be examining that, be asking questions. Be willing to have the discussions. This was great. I had a great time discussing with people on this post and in person these different perspectives. And it is a righteous, holy thing to do. But do so kindly. Always kindly, and always especially kindly to the weaker brother. Never, never, never insult them for listening to their conscience and for paying attention and for being willing to talk to you about it. Look, have you thought about this? Is there anything in you? You need to check yourself. Is there anything in you, anything from what you understand from the Word, and anything from what you understand from the day that would feel objectionable to this before your Lord? And if you can conscionably say no, and give actual reasons and cite your sources. Make sure you know the text. Make sure you know the history, and then make sure you know how you are going to participate. In what way you find ethical, and what ways would you not do this, and then decide on your views. And so this is kind of how I've constructed my views. Again, I'm very open in the future of changing this. I'm very thankful that I've had brothers and sisters in Christ who have even challenged me on my views, and also I've been able to share my views with them, and it helps give them pause to think about. But I always ended it with, if there's anything in your conscience that of what I'm saying would be problematic, then don't do it. Very, very important that we walk together in this world, not of this world, being lights in the world. Don't retreat from the world, be lights in the world, and how you engage with it. And that includes how we celebrate these various cultural holidays. All right, so I wanted to share that with you. Thanks a lot for joining me. Have a great day.